We need principles to decide whether a sector of the economy should be owned privately or publicly. And here's some examples of what those principles could look like. The first one we can call natural monopoly. We have to determine if a sector of the economy lends itself or is a natural monopoly. These are sectors where the infrastructure costs and barriers to entry are very, very high, so that the most efficient arrangement for society is to have a single network or a single infrastructure set up. Good examples are things like road infrastructure or rail infrastructure or a water or sewerage infrastructure. In these instances, it would be very inefficient to have a whole series of parallel roads owned by different companies. So road infrastructure is a natural monopoly. It costs a lot of money to build roads, it costs a lot of money to maintain roads. It makes sense to just have one road network. That's a natural monopoly. It also makes sense to have one organization looking after the maintenance of that single monopoly infrastructure. Otherwise, there's the risk of free riding, which is one company will try not to do maintenance, so the other company has to do maintenance, and in the end our road infrastructure collapses because no one's maintaining it because it costs money to maintain, or we'll end up in a system where there'll just be tolls at every corner. So you can see how roads are a natural monopoly, and having competition on road network would be a hellscape nightmare. Toll roads should be banned. But in a natural monopoly, you want one enterprise in control. However, if it's a private for-profit enterprise, they will exploit their natural monopoly to maximize profit at the expense of everyone using that infrastructure, which is most of society. If a sector involves a natural monopoly, this favors that sector being publicly owned. If a sector is much more competitive with low infrastructure costs and low barriers to entering that sector, then this favors having it being privately owned. Natural monopoly is our first principle. The degree to which an industry or sector is a natural monopoly determines if it should be publicly owned or privately owned. The more a sector is kind of like a natural monopoly, the greater and the stronger the argument is for it being publicly owned. The second principle is physical survival. It's pretty basic. We have to determine if people need the outputs from a sector in order to survive physically. When private enterprises produce something with an inelastic demand because people need it to survive, like drinking water or crucial medicines, then they can exploit and do exploit this fact. Private for-profit enterprises exploit this fact to maximize profits because they have people over a barrel. We need these things to survive, and we'll pay anything to get them. So this is our second principle. If the outputs provided by a particular industry or sector are necessary for physical survival, then this is a strong argument in favor of that sector being publicly owned. However, if the goods and services provided by a sector are not necessary for physical survival, and the more that they are not necessary for physical survival, the stronger the argument is for having that sector be made up of private enterprises. So if a sector's outputs are discretionary and they fulfill desires or people's wants rather than people's actual genuine needs, then that favors having that sector be privately owned. The third principle is the percentage of population. We have to determine what percentage of the overall population uses the services or products produced by that sector. If everyone in society is using something produced by a sector, this lends an argument in favor of that sector being publicly owned. However, if a sector is only used by a small minority of people, then it favors that sector being privately owned. Of course, these principles work together, so some sectors are only used by a small number of people, but it's necessary for those people's physical survival. We have to balance considerations for these different principles. If a limited number of people use a product or service, then this favors having it be privately owned enterprises that control and manufacture that good or provide that service. The more of a population that uses a sector's outputs, the greater the argument is and the stronger the argument is in favor of public ownership in that sector. The next principle is inequity risk. This is where we have to determine if a high level of inequity could result from having certain ownership structures. Inequity here refers to unfair or unjust circumstances that result from avoidable differences, poor governments, or corruption, or the exclusion of certain groups. So it's not about being equal, it's more about fairness and justice. If having private enterprises operate in a sector produces inequitable outcomes, then this will favor that sector being publicly owned. On the other hand, if having public enterprises control a sector produces inequitable outcomes, then obviously this will favor that sector being controlled by private enterprises. The fifth principle has to do with whether or not the sector provides non-economic or non-financial benefits to society. These are kind of abstract benefits, and they're hard to value in financial or economic terms because there often is a greater value that is not measured in money. These are the kinds of outputs that are often an indirect result of providing a good or service. These abstract benefits are hard to value and hard to measure in precise financial terms because their value is often not related to money. Private enterprises are incentivized to maximize financial and economic returns, and therefore they're not very well suited as enterprises to providing these non-financial, non-economic goods. They're a secondary byproduct of providing the initial goods or service. Sectors that provide goods for society that are hard to measure in terms of money or economic output favor public ownership because private enterprises are not incentivized to provide these goods and services because they don't provide the economic benefit that private for-profit enterprises need to motivate their activities. Sectors that provide non-economic benefits to society should be publicly owned in general, whereas the more that a sector's outputs can be measured and quantified in mostly or purely financial terms, lend themselves to being better for private ownership.